Mountain man, still a virgin, at 40, until a fat widow asked to stay with him to escape her husband. The night was cold in Silver Bluff, the little frontier town pressed against the Colorado mountains. Lanterns flickered along the muddy streets, and inside the saloon men whispered about the Zuck family's shame. "Old Zuck's selling his daughter," one of them spat, slamming down a shot of whiskey. "Said she's too heavy, too slow, no man will ever want her unless she comes with land." Out on the ridge above town, Miriam Zuck stumbled through the snow. Her shawl clung tight around her broad shoulders, but no cloth could cover the weight pressing down on her heart. She was only 22, yet her father had declared she would be sold off like cattle to the first bidder who'd take her. Ashamed and hopeless, Miriam wandered toward the old cabin that everyone said was cursed. It had sat empty for years, its roof half collapsed, its hearth stone cold. She whispered into the wind, "Maybe if I end it here, they'll forget me." But inside the cabin, a giant of a man was kneeling by the fire he had just coaxed back to life. Kenneth Boone, 40 years old, mountain-born, broad as an ox, had paid 10 cents at auction for this ruined shack that nobody else wanted. For him, it was a chance at solitude. The door banged open. Kenneth turned and saw her, a weeping woman with snow tangled in her hair, her face pale with despair. "What in God's name?" he started, but Miriam collapsed at his feet, whispering, "Please, just let me die." When Kenneth lifted her into his arms, a folded paper slipped from her shawl, a marriage contract, signed by her father. It bound her to the cabin itself. Whoever owned the land also owned her hand in marriage. Kenneth froze, staring at the paper, then at the trembling woman. By law and by fate, he was now her husband. Morning came gray and bitter over Silver Bluff. Miriam awoke beneath a quilt that smelled faintly of pine smoke. For a moment she thought she was still in her childhood room, but then she saw the rough-hewn rafters above, the single window covered with frost, and the silent man by the fire. Kenneth Boone sat sharpening an axe, the blade catching the light. He looked like a statue carved from the very mountains, tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by wind and time. He had lived alone for decades, his name a ghost spoken only when folks in town mocked the virgin hermit. When Miriam stirred, he rose, awkward and uncertain. "You fainted," he said simply. "Eat something." He set before her a tin plate of beans, cooked clumsily but warm. Miriam blushed, pulling the quilt tighter around her. She was used to stares. Men laughed at her size. Women whispered that she was too broad, too plain, too much. But Kenneth's gaze held no cruelty, only a blunt honesty that unsettled her more than hatred ever had. On the table lay the marriage contract. Miriam swallowed hard. "You must hate this," she whispered, "being shackled to me by my father's trickery." Kenneth grunted, sliding the paper back into her shawl. "I don't take kindly to men who sell their daughters. That's his shame, not yours." In town, word spread quickly. By noon, whispers curled like smoke through the saloon. "Did you hear? Miriam Zuck ran off to the mountains. Old Boone bought the cabin. Guess that makes her his bride now." The laughter rang cruel and sharp. That Saturday, Kenneth led Miriam down to the market for supplies. She walked close to him, head bowed, but the jeers found her all the same. "Look at that," a rancher snorted. "The fat girl finally found a man desperate enough." "More like too dumb to know better," another chuckled. Miriam's face burned. She wanted to vanish, to sink into the snow. But Kenneth, who had said little all morning, suddenly turned. His voice thundered over the street. "Enough!" The men froze, startled by the raw force in his tone. Kenneth's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed as though he might strike them down with his hands alone. Instead, he placed himself squarely at Miriam's side. "This woman is under my roof, under my name. You'll speak of her with respect, or you'll answer to me." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the crunch of Miriam's boots as she hurried away, tears stinging her eyes. But in her chest, something stirred, something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, someone had stood for her. That night, as snow fell heavy around the cabin, Miriam lit a lantern and began to tidy the place. She patched holes in the curtains with scraps of cloth from her bundle, swept ash from the hearth, and set bread to rise. Kenneth watched quietly from the doorway. He had bought the cabin seeking solitude, nothing more. Yet, with every stitch Miriam made, with every flame she coaxed to life, she seemed to be stitching something into him as well, something he had long forgotten: warmth, purpose, belonging. And though he had never touched a woman in his 40 years, he found himself wondering if perhaps fate had done him a strange kindness. Winter deepened its grip on Silver Bluff, the wind howling through the mountain passes like a pack of wolves. Kenneth and Miriam braced themselves for the season together, each day testing the strange bond fate had forced upon them. One morning, Kenneth slung a pack over his broad shoulders. "We'll need flour and lamp oil," he said, fastening his axe to his belt. "It's a half-day's walk to town, but the trail won't be easy." Miriam hesitated at the cabin door, her breath fogging in the cold. She wasn't built for trudging through snowdrifts, and the thought of facing the townsfolk's mocking eyes again made her stomach knot. But Kenneth only offered her his heavy cloak. "Stay close to me," he said. "The trail's rough, but I'll see you through." The path wound between cliffs dusted with white, the river below half frozen and whispering beneath its icy shell. Miriam stumbled more than once, her skirts heavy with clinging snow, but Kenneth never let her fall. Each time she faltered, his hand was there calloused, steady, unshakable. "Why are you so kind to me?" she asked softly after one slip left her clinging to his arm. He glanced at her, eyes pale as the winter sky. "Because no one else ever was, and because kindness costs me nothing." By the time they reached town, Miriam's cheeks were flushed, her lungs burning. She dreaded the stares awaiting them, and indeed the market stalls quieted as the pair walked past. Whispers curled like smoke. A child pointed, a woman tittered behind her glove. Kenneth kept his stride even, his hand resting lightly at Miriam's elbow, steering her as though she were royalty instead of ridicule. When a group of young men muttered crude jokes within earshot, Kenneth turned, his voice sharp as an axe on stone. "Say it again," he warned. The men blanched and slunk away, muttering apologies. Miriam's heart leapt fear, yes, but also something sweeter. For once she wasn't facing the cruelty of the world alone. On the way home, snow began to fall thick, swallowing the trail. Kenneth paused under a stand of pines, building a quick shelter of branches and canvas. Miriam shivered as she settled beneath it, but then he wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders. He built a small fire, the smoke curling into the night. Soon the smell of boiling broth filled the air. He handed her a tin cup. "Drink. It'll warm you." The soup was thin, But Miriam had never tasted anything so comforting. She glanced at the hulking man across the fire, his face lit by the flickering glow. He was silent, brooding, almost grim, but when her eyes met his, he gave a small nod, as if to say, "You are safe here." Later, as they trudged the final miles home under moonlight, Miriam's steps grew heavy. Her body ached, her breath ragged. "Go on without me," she gasped. "I'll only slow you down." Kenneth stopped dead in the snow. He turned, scooped her up in his arms, and carried her the rest of the way as though she weighed nothing at all. "I told you," he said quietly, "I don't leave people behind." Back at the cabin, Miriam collapsed by the fire, her exhaustion melting into gratitude. She watched as Kenneth shed his coat, stoked the flames higher, and set their few supplies in order. It struck her then this man who had lived 40 years alone, untouched by a woman's hand, was slowly learning the shape of companionship, and she, who had always been mocked as too heavy, too much, was discovering what it meant to be cherished not for her usefulness, not for her dowry, but for herself. The journey to town had been only miles across snow, but to Miriam it felt like she had crossed a lifetime's worth of distance from loneliness into something far more dangerous and far more beautiful: hope. The cabin that had once been little more than a ruin slowly transformed under Miriam's care. Each day she rose before dawn, lighting the hearth until its glow drove back the winter chill. She hummed old Amish hymns as she swept the floor, patched the threadbare curtains, and baked bread in the iron stove Kenneth had nearly forgotten how to use. For Kenneth, accustomed to silence and cold meals, the change was staggering. The cabin smelled of stew simmering, of pine resin burning clean in the fire. Quilts appeared on the bed, colorful patches stitched by Miriam's patient hands. When he returned from chopping wood, she was there, her cheeks flushed from heat, her broad frame bent over her work. At first, Kenneth hovered awkwardly. He had lived so long without company that he did not know where to put himself. But Miriam, with gentle persistence, began to draw him into the rhythms of shared life. One morning, she found him splitting logs outside. She stepped forward, her breath white in the frosty air. "Show me," she said. He frowned. "It's heavy work." "All the more reason I should learn." With hesitant patience, Kenneth placed the axe in her hands, guiding her stance. She struggled, the first swing clumsy, but his hand covered hers, steadying her, and together they brought the blade down true. When the log split clean, Miriam laughed a bright sound that startled him more than a gunshot. "Again," she said, determination flashing in her eyes. So he taught her, and when her arms gave out, he carried the wood inside himself. That night, Miriam teased, "You'll have me chopping as strong as you before winter's end." Kenneth only grunted, but his lips twitched, the ghost of a smile. Meals became their shared ritual. Miriam insisted on setting the table properly, even if it was only tin plates. Kenneth, unthinking, always let her serve herself first until one evening she caught him. "You eat first," she said, pushing the ladle into his hand. He shook his head. "You worked harder for it. You take it." And that was how it went, each insisting the other deserved more. For Miriam, used to being last in everything, it was a revelation. For Kenneth, who had never known the instinct to put someone else before himself, it became habit. Winter storms battered the cabin, snow piling against the door, wind shrieking through the eaves. Yet inside, warmth grew. They read by lamplight, Kenneth stumbling through Scripture with his deep, halting voice, Miriam smiling at his effort. She mended his shirts by the fire, her hands moving with quiet skill, while he carved small wooden figures to place on the mantel. Sometimes, when the blizzards raged hardest, they simply sat in silence, listening to the storm outside. The fire painted their faces in gold, and though no words passed, something stronger than speech settled between them. One evening, Miriam woke to find Kenneth asleep in the chair by the hearth, head tilted, arms crossed. He had stayed awake to keep the fire going for her. She crept closer, laid a quilt across his shoulders, and whispered into the stillness, "You deserve more than this lonely life." He stirred but did not wake. For a moment she dared to reach out, brushing a lock of hair from his brow. In the firelight his face seemed less severe, almost gentle. Her heart thudded with a dangerous new awareness. She was falling in love with him, but she carried her weight like armor. "He would never want a woman like me," she told herself. And yet, every glance, every act of kindness, every silence they shared, told another story. Kenneth, too, wrestled with unfamiliar feelings. He had lived 40 years untouched by a woman, guarding himself against disappointment. But as Miriam's laughter filled the cabin, as her courage shone when she faced the sneers of the town, he felt something shift inside him. He had bought solitude with 10 cents. Instead, he had been given a companion who made solitude impossible. The cabin that had once been a place of retreat was now a home. And though neither dared speak it aloud, both felt the same truth pressing on their hearts. Life together had become more than survival. It had become something worth fighting for. Spring thaw loosened the mountain snows, and with it came strangers. One morning, Miriam heard the crunch of wagon wheels on the trail below the cabin. She stepped outside, apron still dusted with flour, to see a man in a tailored coat and polished boots dismounting a fine bay horse. His smile was sharp, his eyes sharper. "Thomas Wheeler," he introduced himself, though in time Silver Bluff would know him better as Augustus Pierce. "I represent the Western Pacific Railway. Fine piece of land you got here, very fine indeed." Kenneth appeared in the doorway, broad as the lintel itself. "It's not for sale." Wheeler's smile never faltered. "Everything is for sale, my good man. The company needs this stretch for expansion. There's a spring on your land, and control of water means control of the valley. We're prepared to pay." Before Kenneth could answer, Miriam stepped forward, her voice steadier than her racing heart. "This land is mine." She held up a folded paper, creased and worn, but unmistakably legal. "My father signed it over in a marriage pact. The deed names me rightful owner of 50 acres and the spring." For a moment, Wheeler's mask slipped, his smile turning brittle. "A woman," he said, almost laughing. "Do you think courts honor the claims of women of fat Amish girls no less? Don't be ridiculous." The words cut like knives, but Miriam did not waver. "The deed was registered in Pennsylvania. Its standing is lawful here. You cannot bully us off." Kenneth's hand settled on her shoulder, solid as stone. "You heard her. Now ride." Wheeler mounted, but his eyes burned with fury. "You'll regret this defiance. The railway always wins." In town, whispers multiplied. At the mercantile, women sneered behind their baskets. "Did you hear? That Zuck girl thinks she owns land now. Imagine her, of all people, standing against the railway." Men muttered in saloons that Kenneth Boone was a fool, bewitched by a fat widow with delusions. Miriam bore the gossip with bowed head, but when she and Kenneth returned home, she let the tears fall. "They'll never see me as anything but a joke." Kenneth tipped her chin up, his eyes fierce. "Let them laugh. You've more courage than any of them. They'll see." But Wheeler's threats proved more than talk. One night, the cabin windows shattered under thrown stones. Flames licked the barn, set by unseen hands. Kenneth fought the blaze until his palms blistered, but the horses were lost. Days later, deputies came with a warrant. Wheeler had accused Kenneth of assaulting a railway foreman. The sheriff, sympathetic but bound by law, had no choice. Kenneth was taken in irons, dragged to town as neighbors looked on. Miriam stood alone in the snow outside the smoking ruin of the barn. The men Wheeler had sent jeered as they rode off. "See how long your mountain husband lasts in jail," one taunted. That night, Miriam walked the miles into town. Her skirts froze stiff around her legs, her lungs burned with cold, but she knocked on every door pleading with townsfolk, deputies, even the sheriff himself. Most turned her away. Some smirked. "Go home, girl. Let the men handle business." Exhausted, she finally found her way to Pastor John Avery. He listened as she unfolded the deed, as she told him of Kenneth's arrest, as her tears soaked the paper. The old minister laid a hand over hers. "Child," he said gently, "you have the truth on your side, and truth, though slow, will prevail." For the first time in her life, Miriam realized she could not wait for others to fight her battles. She would have to stand not just for herself, but for Kenneth, for their land, for the home they had begun to build together. And in the quiet of the parsonage, by flickering lamplight, Miriam prayed, not for rescue, but for courage, because she knew the fight was only beginning. Winter's Edge had barely loosened its grip when Augustus Pierce returned. He did not come alone. Wagons rolled up the valley road at dusk, lanterns glowing like hungry eyes. Armed men spilled from them, rifles slung, torches ready. Inside the cabin, Miriam stiffened as the dogs barked. Kenneth rose from the hearth, his face grim. "They've come." Miriam's heart pounded, but she straightened. "Then we stand." The first shout split the night. "Come out, Boone! Hand over the deed, and maybe we let you live." Kenneth opened the door, stepping into the lantern light, his height casting a long shadow. "This is our land. You've no claim here." Pierce's sneer twisted. "Your land? No, it belongs to progress, to steel and steam. Step aside or burn with it." He gestured, and his men surged forward. Shots cracked. Wood splintered as bullets struck the cabin walls. Kenneth fired back with his hunting rifle, each shot deliberate. He was no stranger to violence. His years of solitude had not dulled the soldier's instincts he carried from a youth of hard fighting. Miriam pulled buckets of water, dousing sparks that caught on the roof. Her arms shook, but she did not falter. She loaded cartridges, passed them to Kenneth, her voice steady, though her body trembled. "I'm with you." The attackers pressed harder. Flames caught the barn again, illuminating the night in an orange blaze. Through the smoke, Pierce strode closer, revolver in hand, shouting, "Drag her out! She's the weak link!" But when his men lunged for Miriam, she did not cower. She stepped forward, clutching the deed in her hand, her voice ringing above the chaos. "This land is mine," she cried. "By law, by God, and by blood it is mine. You cannot steal what was never yours." The men faltered, confused by her ferocity. And in that pause, Kenneth struck. He charged like a bear loosed from its chain, seizing the nearest thug and hurling him into the snow. Another swung a rifle butt. Kenneth absorbed the blow, then drove him back with a fist that cracked bone. Bullets whined, smoke thickened. Still Kenneth fought, and still Miriam stood beside him, her courage a shield no bullet could pierce. Finally, when dawn's first gray light touched the ridge, the battle broke. Pierce lay in the snow, disarmed and bound, his men scattered or captured by townsfolk who had come at last summoned by Pastor Avery's midnight bell. The sheriff rode in, weary but resolute. He looked at Miriam, hair wild, dress singed, deed clutched to her chest. Then at Kenneth, bloodied but unbowed. "By law," the sheriff said, "this land belongs to you, and by God you've defended it well." Kenneth turned to Miriam, sinking to one knee despite his wounds. In the stillness after fire and fury, his voice broke with tenderness. "I don't ask because of contracts or deeds. I ask because my heart is yours. Miriam, will you truly be my wife?" Her tears fell onto his rough hand as she whispered, "I already am." The cabin still bore scars of the night's battle-scorched beams, shattered shutters, the acrid scent of smoke. Yet within its walls the hearth glowed steady, casting warmth over the two souls who had fought so fiercely to keep it. Miriam sat near the fire, quilt draped around her shoulders, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from release. Kenneth lowered himself beside her, bandaged from the fray, his large frame weary but unbroken. For the first time in years, his eyes carried not solitude, but peace. "You're safe here," he murmured, reaching for her hand. His voice, deep and rough, carried the weight of a vow. Miriam pressed her forehead to his shoulder, tears soaking into his shirt. "It feels like home," she whispered, if you'll still have me." Kenneth tilted her chin so their eyes met. "I will have you until my last breath. This cabin, this land, this life, none of it means a thing without you." Outside, the wind swept softly through the pines as if the mountain itself bore witness. Smoke curled upward into the pale morning sky, carrying away the ashes of their enemies, leaving only the promise of renewal. They sat together in silence, the firelight dancing across their faces. Two broken souls bound now by love, by courage, and by the stubborn will to endure. But as dawn spilled across the valley, a question lingered in the air like the echo of distant thunder. Would their love be strong enough to withstand the world beyond the ridge, the greed, the prejudice, the endless hunger for power? Only time would tell. Every time I share a story like Miriam and Kenneth's, I'm reminded that love often blooms in the most unlikely places between broken walls, on frozen nights, within hearts that once believed they were unworthy. Their courage speaks across time, telling us that kindness and faith can outlast cruelty and greed. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from in the world? Do you still believe in a love strong enough to face every trial? If you do, stay close, because the next story is waiting for you.